Is the US dollar losing its power in the world? That question keeps bankers, government officials, investors, and now anxious Americans up at night. Since World War II, the US dollar has been the backbone of global trade, a safe haven in turbulent times, and occasionally the only viable means of doing trade in certain regions. Lately, the headlines have changed, however. Between America's ticking debt time bomb, China's push for de-dollarization, and now a rebuking of international trade by the current administration, there's certainly reason to be worried. Is the dollar's reign coming to an end after a century of dominance? Should we be panicked? Or is this an overblown news story driven by investor mania? Let's break down what's really going on with the US dollar and what this means for you in this week's Modern Problems YouTube channel video. Let's start with a quick recap of the US dollar's history. The US dollar has been used dating back to the Revolutionary War as a means of funding government spending. Up through 1913, the dollar lacked stability, leading to the creation of the Federal Reserve to oversee the currency system. At this time, the dollar and many other currencies were on the gold standard, so for every unit of currency in circulation, there was an equivalent amount of gold stored, allowing for stability. However, during World War I, many countries began to flirt with the idea of abandoning this practice to pay for their outrageous military spending. This led to severe international currency fluctuations, especially in the British pound, the world's de facto reserve currency at the time. Fast forward to World War II, and the US dollar had functionally overtaken the pound as the leading reserve currency, given the size of the US economy, its commitment to the gold standard, and crucially, trust in the US government. The 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement formalized this, crowning the US dollar as the world's preeminent reserve currency, meaning that oil, gold, and most international trade was priced in US dollars. Additionally, foreign central banks began to stockpile US dollars for trade. Why does this matter? Well, it gave the US government the ability to borrow cheaply, run large deficits, and influence foreign economies due to what's been coined as exorbitant privilege as the world's reserve currency. Essentially, the US government was fiscally free to do whatever it wanted because other countries needed US dollars to do business, so there'd always be demand for US debt. With the high global demand for its debt, the US could actually issue it at a lower interest rate, making it very cheap for the government to spend. Looking ahead to today, the dollar has been removed from the gold standard, leading to less stability and, importantly, less fiscal discipline. While the dollar still dominates, the cracks are now impossible to ignore, with the dollar index down nearly 9% year to date. So, why is that? Well, first, America's spending addiction. The US national debt is now over $36 trillion, with interest rates alone bigger than the Pentagon's budget, with no end in sight. Investors are starting to question if the US will actually be able to pay off this heinous spending, which makes the cost to borrow higher, in turn making the payments higher. A negative cycle for sure. Then there's the weaponization of the US dollar, as the US uses its currency as a geopolitical tool, sanctioning rivals, freezing assets, and flexing its financial muscles, as you can see what's happened to Russia. That's powerful, but it's also making other countries nervous. If you're China and you're seeing how Russia was cut out of the global financial system, you're going to make plans to work outside of the US financial system to avoid the same trap. This then led to the advent of the BRICS economies. China and Russia specifically are pushing back, trading oil in yuan, building alternative payment systems, and slowly diversifying their reserves. They will not by any means replace the US dollar anytime soon, but they're beginning to tilt away from what has been US dollar dominance. And lastly, digital disruption. Central bank digital currencies, cryptocurrencies, and new payment rails are making it easier to move money without touching the dollar. You hear a lot about Bitcoin replacing the dollar. While I don't see that happening anytime soon, there is a use case for cryptocurrency. I recommend my video on Bitcoin for more information here. And so as you see, faltering investor confidence in the dollar makes sense. While this decline may be rational, I don't see the dollar as doomed just yet. In reality, the US dollar is still on top of the global trade world. However, it is on a slow decline as the world evolves around it. In the year 2000, it made up about 70% of global reserves, falling to 58% today, suggesting a substantial, yet waning lead. So, why does it still hold the pole position? Well, first is trust and liquidity. The US Treasury market is the deepest and most liquid in the world. When things get scary, everyone still generally wants dollars. While Trump is trying to reverse this with his attacks on the Fed and isolationist policies, investors are still largely holding on. His rhetoric may signal a reversal of the trend, but it's too early to make the call that this is the dollar's doomsday. As at the end of the day, the world financial system still really revolves around US government debt. And then there's no real rivals. The euro is hobbled by political infighting, the Chinese yuan is tightly controlled for the sole benefit of the Chinese economy. Gold is cool, but you can't wire it across the world in seconds. And crypto lacks the trust of the banking system. Just like the dollar, these currencies have their own struggles, so there's no clear replacement for it. And then there's the network effects. Global trade, debts, and the whole financial system are all built around the dollar. Changing that is like trying to swap out the engine of a car while you're speeding down the highway. Of course, it's possible, but it's not easy, especially when you don't even know which engine you'd replace it with. But, as mentioned, the trend is shifting. Central banks are quietly adding more gold, more non-dollar currencies, and experimenting with digital assets. The dollar's dominance isn't collapsing, but it is eroding bit by bit. And recent news from the White House might be accelerating this trend by undermining confidence in the US government's fiscal system. So, if the US dollar does continue its slide, what will then happen? Naturally, borrowing will get more expensive. The US government can't print its way out of trouble. Imports will cost more, inflation risk rises, and American influence takes a hit. These things are all already happening, and so I can see a continuation of all of these trends. Not good if you're the US government trying to manage an out of control budget. Then, for the world, more currency volatility, higher transaction costs, potentially a fragmented system with several mini reserve currencies instead of one global standard. Alongside the severing of global trade networks, the fracturing of currency reserves into many different regional currencies is likely to happen. For example, if you're doing business in Europe, then you're going to want to have the euro. If in China, then the yuan, etc., etc. This will force economies to narrow down trading partners to regional allies and could lead to further reversal of the globalization of international trade. And finally, for you, if you live in the US, your dollar won't go as far. The cost of international business will be greater, and the value of your savings will be less. If you invest globally, you need to give more credence to currency risk. For businesses, there's going to be a greater focus on domestic trade, as currency swings will be a deterrent to expanding internationally. Here's the thing though, this whole shift is slow and messy. There's no obvious replacement waiting in the wings. If anything, the US dollar isn't getting replaced as the reserve currency. It's just going to lose its influence as countries move to a more regional model for international trade. So let's come up with an action plan for those worried about the decline of the US dollar. While you're not going to avoid the accompanying chaos in the US's fiscal policy, you can work to position yourself better to weather the storm. Diversify. Don't put all your eggs in one currency basket. Global assets, gold, and even crypto can help hedge your bets. I don't recommend ditching all your US denominated assets yet, but it's worth hedging with a bigger basket. Stay informed. Watch what central banks, big corporations, and global institutions are doing, not just what they're saying. If other countries are rapidly offloading US debt, then maybe it's time to take this a little more seriously. And embrace change. The financial world is evolving. Digital currencies, new payment systems, and shifting alliances are the new normal. This ties into the previous point. Try to stay on top of what's going on and don't get left behind. And think globally. Whether you're investing, running a business, or just planning your next vacation, be ready for a world where the dollar isn't the only game in town. If you're doing business in North America, then you might be totally fine. But if you're now operating in Europe or Southeast Asia, maybe it's time to think a little bit more about the euro or the yuan, respectively. And as global tensions shift, be careful and act accordingly. You may not be able to run an effective operation in both the US and China if tensions come to blow in the South China Sea. So choose wisely for what works best for you and your business. So, is the dollar's decline the end of the world? No. But is it the end of an era? Most likely. The world is moving towards a more multipolar system, less dollar-centric, more diverse, and a lot more unpredictable. The best way to survive? Stay curious, be flexible, and keep watching Modern Problems for the latest breakdowns on how global shifts will affect your wallet, your job, and your future. If you have any thoughts, predictions, or future video topics, please comment down below. I love to hear what you think about our world's modern problems. So thank you for watching this week's video. I hope you enjoyed taking the time to educate yourself on one of the major issues facing our society. And as always, stay informed and have a great rest of your day.